So this is Chapter 2, Section 2. In this section, we're going to discuss the rebellion mentality of the colonists, examine the organization of the Continental Congress, and analyze the early documents such as the Declaration of Independence. And so this is going to lead up to what happens when the people start wanting to rebel and ultimately do. The First Continental Congress assembled because Americans wanted more rights. They was realizing that the king was taking advantage of them in a lot of different areas. Mercantilism is a theory that a country should sell more goods to a country than it buys. This is common economics or basic economics. You know that if you sell more than you buy, then you make money. And when George III established mercantilism in England, he tried to squeeze as much out of colonies as possible. Now, this wasn't something uncommon. The colonists were used to this kind of stuff, but they felt like they were being taken advantage of. That King George was putting England ahead of the colonies. Basically, it was if the colonies fail, oh, no big deal, but I want to make sure that England stays successful. And so they would buy raw material, stuff like trees and the different things, fish and just things that were came naturally. Things that would come out of the earth in terms of whatever. There's a lot of it was like trees and stuff like that for wood. But there's other things also, things that would grow, um, things that grew naturally. The England would buy these cheap from them and then turn around and make products, like make stuff out of the wood, and then sell them back to the colonists for about 3 times the price. And so the colonists felt they were getting the bad end of the deal because they were providing the materials and still having to pay a lot of money for it. And there's a video on mercantilism if you want to watch it on Google Classroom. Parliament demanded that the colonies sell raw materials such as cotton and lumber to England at a low price, but the colonists had to buy British goods at a high price, like I just said. After 1763, it got worse because Great Britain had just fought a long, costly war against the French and Indian War, and won lands in North America from the French. To cover this added new cost, they started heavily taxing the American colonies. Now, this war was very costly. They got territory out of it, so they had to start doing stuff in the new territories. And so they basically said, look, we were defending your area, so you're going to have to pay more in taxes to cover the cost of this war. And the colonists didn't like that. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which required colonists to pay tax on newspaper and all legal documents. The colonists resented this, but they had no representation, so there was really nothing they could do. This would lead to the slogan, no taxation without representation. And that's what the colonists are going to base this off of, is that if you're not going to represent us in Parliament, if we're not going to have members of Parliament that are from the colonies, then we don't want to pay taxes anymore because we're not getting represented, so we shouldn't have to pay taxes. Because Parliament and the King kept pushing more and more taxes through to pay for the French and Indian War. To protest, the colonists issued a boycott. Now, the word boycott just means you refuse to buy. You hear this a lot of times, like, if a company does something, like, for example, Target and Starbucks typically side with liberal politics. And so a lot of conservatives a lot of times will say, I'm going to boycott Target, I'm going to boycott Starbucks because they promote this issue. And the same thing, there's a lot of places that are boycott because they sell things about Donald Trump or whatever. If you try to get people to not buy because in theory, that's going to hurt their bottom dollar and they're going to feel the effects of it because of it. The boycott worked and Parliament agreed to repeal or cancel the Stamp Act. The Parliament soon added new taxes to replace the Stamp Act. They also passed the Declaratory Acts, which basically said Parliament can tax and make decisions for the American colonies in all cases. And this is going to be something that the colonists are not going to like. Relations worsened as they passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Tea Company the right to ship tea without paying the same taxes the colonial merchants had to pay. They sold it cheap to shopkeepers, bypassing colonial merchants. The colonists blocked all East India Company ships from entering any port except for the Boston Harbor, which would lead to the Boston Tea Party, which was to protest the British taxes. So let's back up just a little bit. What's happening here is that Parliament and the King give the British East India Company the sole rights to sell tea in the colonies. They give them cheaper, they don't have to pay many taxes and things like that. The colonial merchants had to pay special taxes. The East India Company did not, and they couldn't stay afloat because they was having to pay more money to sell the exact same product. And so when you go to shopkeepers and you're like, I'll give you tea at this price, and then the colonial merchants say, well, I got to pay this tax, so it's going to have to be this much higher. The colonial merchants are going to say, no, I'm going to buy from the British because it's cheaper and I can make more money off of my product. And so it hurt the colonial merchants by doing so. And the colonists got really upset because they felt like it was a direct attack towards their economy that the British had did this. And the British East India Company just did it because they had unpaid taxes that they couldn't pay. And to keep the company from going bankrupt, that's the reason why they did it to begin with. The Boston Tea Party was where some colonists, maybe it's on this, yeah. The colonists dressed like Native Americans and dumped tea in the Boston Harbor. So because of this, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which Americans called the Intolerable Acts. These acts restricted colonists' rights, such as trial by jury, got rid of trial by jury. Remember I talked about in the last section how important that was, and allowed searching colonists' homes to quarter in colonists' homes. So it allowed them to start searching colonists' homes and going in their homes and looking for stuff and trying to find things and just invading their privacy. And so the colonists didn't like this because they felt like they were being attacked again. They were no longer getting jury trials. People could search their home without their permission, and they didn't like it. The colonial governments banded together to fight the Intolerable Acts, and in September of 1774, 12 of the colonists sent delegates to Philadelphia to discuss their concerns with all the colonies but Georgia being represented. And these are called delegates or representatives. So when you hear today, we're sending a delegate here, that's just someone that's representing a group of people, whoever sends them. This is going to be the First Continental Congress. The meeting in Philadelphia became known as the First Continental Congress, and a delegate sent a letter to King George III demanding the rights of the colonies be restored. They also made plans to boycott British goods. The delegates vowed to meet again in a year if their needs were not met. So basically they said, look, we're going to boycott British goods. We're not going to buy them anymore. And we demand that you restore our rights. And we'll meet again in a year, and it didn't take that long. And we'll determine what we're going to do next. Well, King George answered with force, and in April 1775, 2 battles took place between British and colonial soldiers at Lexington and Concord. These were known as the first shots of the American Revolution, and ultimately the first battles of the American Revolution. Now, the word independence just means self-reliance and freedom from outside control. And that's what the First Continental Congress and the Continental Army was trying to do, was to establish independence, where we were self-reliant and didn't depend on England anymore. In May of 1775, leaders met again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. Now, this time they spent months debating what they should do, but the ideas of independence were growing. Some colonists were loyal to the crown and never thought it was realistic to win a war with England. I mean, England, it makes sense. England has got the most powerful navy in the world, one of the most powerful armies in the world, one of the most powerful empires in the world, and you are a colony that really doesn't have a whole lot. But they did have home field advantage, and they did have the will to overcome this and win the war. In January 1776, Thomas Paine inspired many others to the idea of independence when he wrote his pamphlet called Common Sense, which is a pamphlet that called for independence. By 1776, many colonists agreed with Paine and agreed they must break away from Great Britain. Now, there's a couple of things about Common Sense. There's a video you can watch. Also, there's an assignment where you have to read a section from Common Sense and then answer questions about it. Basically, Thomas Paine's Common Sense was like, look, we're being led by a bully across the ocean. How come an island across the sea can determine what we do, how much taxes we pay? Why are they over in control of us? And they shouldn't be. Now, Thomas Paine wasn't from the colonies. He just moved there like a year before then. He was friends with Benjamin Franklin, and they kind of worked out a thing together where it was, kind of get him to come here and promote the idea of independence. Congress is now acting as the government for the colonies, And Thomas Jefferson did most of the work in the document that announced the United States independence, the Declaration of Independence. It argued that the British government didn't look out for the good of the colonists. It had a list of grievances where he was complaining about things that the British government did and said, look, it's not right that you're doing this. Now, here's just a couple of quotes from the Declaration of Independence. This says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are the right to life, the right to liberty or freedom, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. He's saying here, look, we have certain rights, and we believe that if to secure these rights, we've established a government, the monarchy, to give us rights and to be governed. But any government that takes these rights away from its citizens needs to be overthrown and have a new government put in its place. And they were basically declaring independence at that point and declaring war on England. The purpose of government is to the rights of the people. It's like he said, the power of the government is received by the governed, by the people who live there. These were not new ideas, but the idea of overthrowing the monarchy was revolutionary, literally. And the ideas of people such as John Locke, if the government misuses its powers, it should lose it. And the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. In theory, the American colonies were independent, but they still have one more obstacle. True freedom would not come until the Revolutionary War ended and Great Britain officially recognized the United States. And so that's what we're seeing leading up to the American Revolution. And then we'll continue in section 3.